Kash Patel's voice erupted across the hall, slicing the marble air into trembling shards. "You speak of democracy," he said, "but you drape freedom like a filthy tablecloth over your power feast. What democracy survives when its table is littered with the bodies of children?" The words didn't echo. They detonated. In a city built on stone facades and slippery alliances, something cracked, visibly, audibly. A crack born not from gunfire, not from protest banners, but from 173 shards of betrayal recovered from the supposed sanctums of American governance. It began quietly, as all great betrayals do. A standard audit, so bureaucratic it barely deserved mention on a Tuesday morning agenda, combed through the archives of the House Intelligence Committee. But what they found stopped clocks. 173 classified documents, marked, tagged, encrypted, no longer resting where the chain of custody swore they should be. 173 pieces of national security, loyalty, blood, and sacrifice, stolen, altered, whispered away into the dark. The trail traced through layers of proxy servers, misfiled timestamps, and administrative errors didn't end in some foreign cyber cave. It circled back. It circled back to Adam Schiff, the darling of televised righteousness, the man who built a career on sanctimony wrapped in cable news spotlights, and hovering just behind him, silent, towering, inescapable, was the shadow of Barack Obama, whose years in office had tilled the soil for this kind of secret bloom to fester. The metadata didn't lie. Neither did the routing tables, the email headers, the security badges logged at unauthorized hours. The House had no choice but to act. The Speaker, once hesitant to stir old ghosts, convened a special hearing under emergency powers. Subpoenas flew like daggers. Adam Schiff was ordered to testify. His staff, his records, his legacy laid bare. The swamp feared the witnesses more than the subpoenas. Kash Patel, who once unraveled the Russia hoax thread by thread, a hunter patient enough to stalk an entire government. Dan Bongino, the hammer that would fall without hesitation, carrying scars from battles fought not on paper but with blood and betrayal in the field. They weren't coming to negotiate. They were coming to reveal. Washington's glittering facade flickered. Donors cancelled galas. Journalists rehearsed apologies. Think tanks drafted denials. They all understood one terrible truth. This wasn't about partisan politics. This was about the exposed underbelly of an empire that had traded honor for power and assumed no one would dare lift the veil. Kash and Dan were coming, and they weren't bringing hope. They were bringing receipts. A new kind of silence settled over Washington's marbled hallways. Not the dignified quiet of solemn governance, but the taut, suffocating hush of a swamp realizing its camouflage had been ripped away. Kash Patel didn't grant the media a smirk or soundbite. He walked into closed-door briefings, sleeves rolled, case files tucked under his arm like surgical instruments destined for an ugly operation. No slogans, no theatrics, just the methodical preparation of a man who knew he wouldn't just expose corruption. He would perform its autopsy live under the flickering, unkind glare of the American public. Dan Bongino chose a different tactic. He didn't issue a press conference. He issued a warning. One sentence, 5 words posted in bold, brutal clarity across his feed. The reckoning is coming. No hashtags, no retouched portraits, just an epitaph pre-written for a political class that thought immunity was hereditary. Meanwhile, Adam Schiff, previously unable to pass a reflective surface without delivering an impromptu monologue, suddenly found himself allergic to microphones. He ducked into black SUVs, scurried past reporters with the grace of a man trying to appear unbothered while checking every 5 seconds if his pants were still on. His office released bland statements so hollow they whistled in the breeze. Congressman Schiff looks forward to cooperating fully with any inquiry. Translated from swamp speak, it meant, "We're lawyering up faster than Hunter Biden at a laptop convention." And then there was Barack Obama. Cool as ever, calculated as always, appearing at public events with an air of intellectual detachment, as if the mushroom cloud behind him were a passing weather report. He smiled for cameras, shook hands with college presidents and Silicon Valley donors with the ease of a man who knew the walls were closing in, but had mastered the art of pretending being devoured was just another speaking engagement. The news cycle, like a bloodhound catching the scent of an overdue kill, began to shift. Anonymous sources whispered of subpoena drafts bearing Obama's name. Editorial boards polished op-eds about the complexities of leadership and the missteps of well-meaning reformers. Corporate code for the dams about to break, and everyone grabbing a life jacket. The stage was set, the masks were slipping, and no amount of eloquence or curated nostalgia would withstand the blunt force trauma of cold, documented betrayal. The doors to the chamber swung open, not with dignity, but with the groaning protest of a house forced to air its own rot. Kash Patel entered first. No grandstanding, just a man holding a folder fat enough to make liars sweat neuron in their sleep. He approached the microphone with the calm indifference of a surgeon about to operate without anesthesia. "A rotten system doesn't grow itself," he said flatly, his voice slicing cleaner than any gavel. "It is cultivated, fed by power, watered by betrayal." For a moment, no one breathed. Adam Schiff, at the end of the committee table, adjusted his tie with the grace of a man wishing he could adjust reality instead. Behind Kash, screens flickered to life, each frame colder than the last. Metadata strings, document trails, security clearance overrides formed a tapestry so damning even the most skilled political contortionists would pull a hamstring trying to escape it. Kash didn't raise his voice. Truth was loud enough without a megaphone. "Every timestamp you see here," he said, gesturing to the timeline illuminating the betrayal in high definition, "is a footprint on the carpet they swore was stainless." A ripple of discomfort shuddered across the room. Schiff leaned into his microphone, affecting the wounded dignity of a man falsely accused. "This is a political spectacle," he muttered. Dan Bongino, leaning back in his chair like a man lounging at a crime scene he'd already solved, cracked a slow grin. "Spectacle?" he drawled. "No, Congressman. This is what happens when the receipts come due and your platinum card of plausible deniability gets declined." A few muffled chuckles rose from the press gallery, even from staffers who knew they were watching history kneecap itself in real time. Kash clicked to the next slide. Cross-verified login records, data trails stitched tighter than a mob lawyer's alibi. "Mistakes don't leave trails this neat," he said. "Intent does." Schiff pressed his lips into a grim line, his eyes darting to the committee chair, silently begging for a lifeline that wasn't coming. Across town, Barack Obama, safe behind velvet ropes and curated book deals, surely heard the first cracks spiderweb across the facade he'd spent a decade polishing. The hearing was only minutes old, and the dam was leaking. Perhaps it was the sound of inevitability, cracking through marble and ego alike, that jolted Schiff into motion. He leaned forward, his face assembling an expression of grave concern, so theatrical it deserved its own lighting director. "This," he began, voice trembling with an artful tremor that had launched 1,000 CNN clips, "is nothing more than a witch hunt, a blatant attempt to silence dissent." The room held its breath, not out of sympathy, but out of the dark curiosity that grips an audience when a man decides mid-free fall to flap his arms and call it flying. Schiff straightened his papers with the prim efficiency of a schoolboy delivering an excuse he hoped sounded original, not realizing the dog had already returned the homework, chewed and incriminating. Dan Bongino, who had been lounging like a man watching the Titanic rebrand itself as a submarine, leaned into his microphone. His grin was slow, surgical. "A witch hunt," he mused, the words rolling lazily off his tongue. He tapped the thick packet of metadata at the edge of his table, the sound crisp as a gavel. "Funny thing about witches, Congressman, they usually don't leave their fingerprints all over the broomsticks they swore they never touched." A low ripple of laughter cracked the chamber's professional veneer. Kash didn't smile. He flipped to the next slide. Login times, terminal IDs, access requests signed. Sometimes in the same 15-minute window, Schiff claimed to be fighting for transparency on national television. "This isn't a hunt, Congressman," Kash said, voice calm and cutting. "It's an inventory check, and your receipts didn't survive the audit." Schiff opened his mouth, perhaps to protest, perhaps to order a double scotch and a one-way ticket to anywhere, but no words came. Reporters scribbled furiously, drafting headlines that would strain every thesaurus in Washington for synonyms of humiliation. Across the committee dais, other members of Schiff's political tribe shifted uncomfortably, calculating the cost of going down with a ship whose captain had decided, in a final act of defiance, to set his own sails on fire. In that widening silence, heavy with the weight of dying narratives, one truth hung heavier than all. This wasn't the beginning of Adam Schiff's defense. It was the autopsy of it. Like any competent coroner, Kash Patel wasn't satisfied merely identifying the corpse. He intended to show, piece by rotting piece, how the murder was planned, financed, and lovingly concealed. Kash flipped the screen, and the room recoiled. A network map bloomed, an obscene garden of names, NGOs, and shell organizations stitched together by grants, influence peddling, and a thick slime of plausible deniability. "What you're seeing," Kash said, voice calm yet merciless, "is not theory, not paranoia. It's accounting." He tapped a cluster labeled Trusted Civic Partners, a polite euphemism for ideological laundromats masquerading as non-profits. "This," he added, "is not grassroots. It's astroturf rolled out by the very architects who sit in this room pretending to smell like roses." Schiff shifted, his knuckles whitening around a pen he wasn't using to take notes. Dan leaned in, voice dripping slow mockery. "You know, for a witch hunt, Kash, this sure looks an awful lot like a tax audit, except the witches filed their own receipts." A ripple of restrained laughter cracked the tension, but Kash didn't pause. He clicked again, and an email thread flooded the screen, dull in presentation but screaming treason in every line break. expedite classified access for trusted entities, pre-coordinate narratives prior to release, neutralize unapproved disclosures at point of origin. Kash lifted his eyes, gaze steady. Neutralize, he repeated. Not debate, not counter. Neutralize. Schiff cleared his throat, reaching for some invisible gravitas. These were standard operating procedures, best practices for safeguarding national security. Dan cocked an eyebrow so sharply it could have sliced paper. Best practices? Congressman, if sabotaging transparency counts as best practice, then the mafia is a TED Talk away from winning a Nobel Peace Prize. Kash ignored the sputtering defense, letting the avalanche of metadata speak louder than the crumbling facade before him. This isn't safeguarding, he said. It's sandbagging democracy with taxpayer money, sanctioned by executive blinks that were never meant to see daylight. His hand hovered over the final chart, a chilling web connecting Schiff's office to NGO beneficiaries who always landed on the right side of every public disclosure and funding initiative. A system, Kash concluded, voice slicing through the room with surgical finality, that the American people never voted for and were never meant to find out about. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of shifting seats, averted eyes, and the faint metallic taste of reputations rusting in real time. The walls of the chamber still stood, but their foundations, built on decades of bureaucratic deceit, trembled, signaling the real collapse was no longer a question of if, but when. Deep rot doesn't announce itself. It leaks, then bursts. Sometimes when it bursts, the flood doesn't just drown reputations, it drowns the illusion that anyone in the system was ever truly innocent. Dan Bongino, who had let Kash play the methodical surgeon, leaned forward, his expression tightening into something colder, harder, unmistakably lethal. "You know," he said, voice low enough to make the microphone strain, "when rot gets bad enough, it stops smelling and starts killing." He tapped a button on his tablet, and the screens exploded into a timeline, not of grants or NGOs, but bullet holes, motorcade schematics, names, suppressed witness reports. The attempted assassination of President Trump, once a briefly acknowledged tragedy, then a memory-hold inconvenience, blazed back into the room with the clarity of an X-ray pointed at a long-ignored tumor. 8 rounds fired, Dan said, each syllable thudding like a drumbeat. 1 disabled Secret Service vehicle. 0 arrests, 0 follow-up, 0 transparency. Schiff cleared his throat, but the sound was thin, reedy, like a clarinet trying to drown out a hurricane. Dan didn't glance at him. "And you know what's funny about cover-ups?" he continued, his grin devoid of humor. "They're not subtle. They're not mistakes. They're signatures." Another click, and the screen displayed internal memos, black bars censoring paragraphs, but the metadata visible and damning. Archive access restricted under executive privilege. Investigation logs sealed pending further directive. Dissemination classified due to national stability concerns. Dan turned toward the panel, his voice climbing, not shouting, but carrying the cutting force of someone sharpening a blade across 1,000 public betrayals. When a gunman fires on a sitting president, and the first instinct isn't to hunt him down, but to bury the paperwork, that isn't national security, he said. That's complicity dressed up in a flag lapel pin. Schiff shifted in his seat, but it was too late. The blood was in the water, and Dan Bongino was the shark who had stopped circling and started biting. This wasn't bureaucracy being cautious, Dan said. It was bureaucracy covering its own ass. And the fingerprints on that cover-up traced back not to some faceless desk clerk, but to the same executive circles that spent 8 years teaching government agencies to act like political hit squads. A gasp cut through the chamber's heavy air as Dan Bongino's words landed like a blade. When a bullet leaves the barrel and the government closes its eyes, that's conspiracy by omission. Kash Patel stood silent, letting Dan's accusation echo. Barack Obama entered, strolling in with the ease of a king unbothered by subpoenas, his smile polished but brittle. Dan muttered, "Look who RSVP'd to his reckoning." Adam Schiff stiffened, his grandstanding instinct crushed by the radioactive spotlight. Obama adjusted his microphone, voice smooth as syrup. "I did what was necessary to protect democracy." Kash leaned forward, contempt flickering. "Even if it meant turning intelligence agencies into your personal hit squad?" Obama's smile cracked. "Hard choices aren't understood by those who don't bear the burden," he said, fingers drumming exit strategies. Dan coughed theatrically. "Hard choices like weaponizing FISA courts?" Reporters hid laughter. Kash's voice cut deeper. "Most won't know the burden of explaining why spying on rivals was called saving the republic." Obama insisted he acted legally, but Dan smirked. "Bank robbers follow frameworks too," after emptying the vault. Tension buzzed like a storm, ready to tear the ceiling. Schiff, grasping for gravitas, stammered, "We acted for the greater good." Obama nodded. "Leaders make unpopular choices." Kash's retort was icy. "Protecting democracy by dismantling liberty? We called that tyranny once." Schiff paled. Obama's charm hardened. Dan pounced. "The greater good always seems to mean the good of those in charge." He tapped declassified directives. "Heroes don't hide behind secret memos." The screens flashed a damning list. Clinton, Obama donors, Epstein Island flights. Dan's voice was conversational, but lethal. "Saving democracy via private jets to Epstein's Island?" Obama stayed calm. "Old friends make bad choices," Kash countered, "but you choose who stays at your table." Dan rose, voice raw. "Not everyone's innocent because they smiled in ads. Some sold children's souls for power." His fist slammed the table. "Burn in hell." The gallery erupted, a nation's silenced rage breaking free. The screams spilled into streets, headlines, "A republic starved for truth." Motions filed swiftly. Schiff faced criminal referral for abuse of office. A special counsel targeted Obama's deep state architecture. Schiff's rebuttal about democracy flopped. Dan murmured, "Lies age fast." Outside, thousands surged, signs blazing. "Truth rises, liars fall." Kash emerged, quiet, lethal. He paused on the Capitol steps, voice carving the moment. "An empire of lies stands until one truth collapses it." Chants roared, unstoppable.